What are you looking for here?
Time. I need time to forgive myself. I need to escape. To forget what I did. I'm going. Are you staying or are you coming too?
No. This was the best month of my life. We're all prisoners of ourselves. And from that, there is no possible escape.
Happy heresies and welcome to the desert of the real. You can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave. So therefore we must go inward, as Peter Gabriel sang in the Carpet Crawlers. You gotta get in to get out, and that's what we're doing here at Aeon Byte. So welcome everybody on this Saturn day. I hope you're doing well, enjoying yourself. I hope you're enjoying the holiday seasons, however you may celebrate it or enduring it if celebration just isn't your thing. My name is Miguel Connor, and I am your Pompadour of Gnosis. But indeed, I think what most people forget, and I have learned, is that the liminal places, the spirit world breaking onto our side, is not just a Halloween thing. It continues all the way to the solstice, and even there. This is a great time to talk to your ancestors, your loved ones that have transformed into other manifestations. And this is the topic today. So I am very excited to have Daniel Bourke with us to discuss a book I really enjoyed. I'm glad this came out into the world. It is unique, and it is Apparitions at the Moment of Death, the Living Ghost and Legend, Lyric and Lore. Daniel, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the invite.
Pleasure is all ours. And with us too, we have the apparition of the Moondog Vance. Vance, how are you doing?
He's quite realistic.
Yes,
very lifelike.
My ectoplasm is very, very solid here this
Absolutely.
morning. And this is an interesting topic for me because I've had a couple of dream apparitions, one notably involving John Lennon, which I might relate later if we have time. And so
I'd be fascinated to hear.
Yeah, and my uncle was said to have seen, his mother and so forth on his deathbed, according to my cousins. So
really, okay.
Yeah.
Wow. It's incredibly common. The deceased relative coming to the deathbed is very common. So I would absolutely love to hear that if you have the time.
Yeah.
It's ubiquitous, as you show in your book, and you give hundreds of examples. So yeah, this ain't your grandma's ghost book, as they would say. This is something new, and we certainly want to unpack it. And for the audience, I see you coming into the chat room. Good to see everybody. As always, if you have any questions for Daniel, please super chat them, or complaints or remarks for Vance and myself, please super chat them so we can separate them. Not much else housekeeping, maybe later. But let's get started. Let's go for it. Daniel, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to write the book.
So this kind of steps to writing the book where, like, I've always it's been many years, maybe up to 15 years since I've had an interest in kind of the near-death experience. That was kind of my stepping in point here, and the reason I say that is because there's a type of experience, and one of the best papers written on it was written in 2010 by Dr. Bruce Grayson. It's called Seeing People Unknown to Have Died, and it deals with peak Indarian experiences. And those are experiences in which the individual, while during a near-death experience, during clinical death, somebody they know dies at a distance during that time. It's a kind of a coincidence that it will happen at some point in some time, but the point is that they we know that encountering deceased relatives is kind of a common thing during the near-death experience, but in these experiences, they meet deceased relatives that they were not aware were actually deceased. So they come back then with that information, which is then later shown to be correct. And these types of experiences were also recorded by the likes of William Barrett in his Deathbed Visions book. There are a couple of accounts in the journals of the Society for Psychical Research, but Grayson brought a couple of cross-cultural accounts in with that paper. And what struck me was, at that point, I had been kind of aware of how common the crisis apparition was in general from reading the works of the like of Camille Flammarion in France, or the kind of phantasms of the living. So I thought, if I look for these, I will find them. I was convinced of it. I was convinced that this is a kind of a natural part of the human experience, to the extent that I would find them if I looked for them. And thankfully, I did. But the original plan wasn't a book. It was just to find maybe 20 or 30, write a little paper, and maybe kind of give an idea, and then somebody else can work on the rest. But it turned into a book, thankfully, and it was quite an experience.
Yes, indeed. And again, you show so much information on how the dead and the living, and again, the liminal places are so active, and the boundaries between death and life almost don't make sense. And you show evidence from ancient Mesopotamia to the far shores of Asia. I mean, this is going on all around. I mean, in today's world, we may think of crisis apparition. I think the two most famous ones would be Macbeth, of course, and keeping with the season, Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, with Scrooge getting visited by his business partner, although it was I think 7 years after, but still, it kind of threw him upside down. And even the idea of seeing the dead and not knowing that they're dead. I believe that happened with Aeneas in ancient Greek, right?
Yes.
Back. Could you tell the
audience? Yes, it did. Yeah, one of the accounts is there are actually a number of crisis apparitions in ancient Greece, and it's interesting you mentioned Hamlet, because like obviously Hamlet is kind of a well-known cultural kind of creation, but with that said, I do often find it surprising then, with that said, how little work has been done specifically on those types of apparitions. And again, that was one of the other reasons I wanted to write the book. And like in the last chapter, I mentioned those Peak and Darien experiences a moment ago. In the last chapter of this book, I deal with discoveries of a distant death which are specifically related to near-death experiences. And in the account you referenced is Annis. And Annis actually meets his mother, who he didn't know was dead at the time. He meets her in the underworld. And I'll just say, as a side note also, there are actually some mainstream scholars who have been noting that these things that parapsychologists have collected for 200 years plus do actually turn up in this literature. And like Debbie Felton, for example, in Haunted Greece and Rome, noted that someone like Crusa, or like the Romulus and Remus, their ghosts were typical crisis apparitions. But it's interesting that even in that book, then you don't see Annis or anything of the kind specifically referenced. Obviously, we can't all hit every one of them. There are going to be many missing in my book also, and I actually really hope that there will be more found in the classical world, those sources. But yeah, Annis doesn't just meet his mother; he also meets a soldier, his friend. It's extremely. I forget the name now. I do forget the name, but he met his friend as a soldier, and then in the underworld, and then when he comes back, he realizes that he actually had died during the time that he had been in the underworld. And this is the kind of fundamental mystery of these experiences. The reason they set themselves apart from, for instance, the typical after-death communication, where you may witness the apparition of a loved one, but it is a loved one that has passed. It is the discovery of this initial information of the death, that kind of the fundamental coincidence between the experience of the apparition and the occurrence of the distant death. It seems to speak truthfully about information in the external world to the individual, and that is kind of the fundamental mystery of it. And the extent to, again, I'll restate, the extent to which it has been recorded is the reason why I knew that if I looked in those sources, I would sure to find some.
Yeah, it's incredible the amount of sources, and you tie it into the cultural context, the folklore, the legend. So it's not you're just not giving data, you give a lot of context. And the reason this hasn't been approached yet, I'm assuming, Daniel, is the same problem science has today. Everybody's in their own little department, right? You've got the church with their Irish and English saints, and then you've got people on
Yes.
the West, and you got Victorian researchers in the 9th century, then you got people in the United States doing NDE research. So everybody's doing it, but nobody's come together in sort of a conference to unite these.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point. Yeah, there's not that much kind of syncretic work done synthesis. Like it's more about these hyper specialized subdivisions, and then there's less people kind of collecting them that way. But I would say that even with that said, and the truth of that statement is it is a true statement. I would say even with that said, I'm surprised with how little work has been done in this area, because like there even in parapsychology, these experiences have been somewhat kind of forgotten about, despite the fact that some of the most prominent work ever done in parapsychology, like in the late 19th century, related specifically to these types of apparitions. And to this day, honestly, I would argue that Phantasms of the Living is the seminal work related to these types of experiences. So it is kind of interesting. I, I would love if more work was done in this area, but we'll see how things pan out, because it is a truly fascinating aspect of the human experience, and not just because of what it may or may not mean, but because of the impact that it has often on the actual individuals. This is something that comes out in the book, especially at the end of the first chapter. I give some examples wherein the individual, for example, may, based specifically on these types of encounters, either have their beliefs in the continuance of consciousness bolstered or actually instantiated in the first place. And that's something that I find interesting, because although much work has been done in previous years, and much work still to be done regarding the possibility that near-death experiences played a role in the instantiation of afterlife beliefs, I think that the crisis apparition may have played a role also.
Well said indeed, and yeah, you're right for sure. And these apparitions is what I like. I know another thing I like about your book is that they were not just normal, but they were part of the health of a society. You know, the shaman
Mm.
goes to see spirits. We should all be talking to our dead and our ancestors. They have messages, they have warnings. Unfortunately, sometimes it's our own death or some doom.
Yeah,
But
very
it
often.
was it really was part of the collective psyche of these tribes, and we've sort of
Mm.
lost us with our fear of death and wanting to put the elderly and the sick isolated from the rest of us. So in a way, your book does, I think, is healthy mentally and spiritually for our society. But for the
Thank you.
audience, just to clarify, Daniel, uh, I used to do ghost hunting here in Chicago, and we'd go down, in the vaults of Al Capone and all that. And of course, we saw stuff. Ghosts would speak through us with all the tools, but that was not necessarily a crisis apparition. So, what separates a crisis apparition, again, for the audience, I know, from your just seeing a ghost?
Mm. So fundamentally, first of all, the term itself was defined as crisis apparition because, well, most commonly, apparitions in general appear around death and crisis.
Mhm.
But the authors of Phantasms of the Living, the volume from the late 19th century, which dealt with hundreds of these types of experiences, which were often very carefully corroborated and followed up on, etc., they defined a crisis apparition as either an apparition which occurs 12 hours before or after the death,
Mm.
but which specifically informs of that death. And just to also note that although that period of 24 hours is helpful, it is arbitrary, and we should remember that simply because you can learn of a distant death. Like I'm more interested in non-ordinary intimations of a distant death, and that can even come in encounters with the kind of typical hunter type ghost, where the kind of report of this: I saw a particular type of person who I've never seen before. They may have disappeared around a corner in a house, and then later on I saw a picture from the old owner of the house, and it was that person. The point there is that the discovery of the death came in that moment. The individual, in fact, in most ideal cases, had no expectation even of the death of the individual who appeared to them. The individual's father may walk in the room, he may look entirely substantial, indistinguishable from to the extent that they don't even necessarily consider the possibility they're looking at a ghost. This is surprisingly common. And it turns out then later, and just to be clear also, they often act very contextually specific to their actual predicament in life, and that's a very important point. So it's not just that they're appearing coincident with the death. That's fascinating. They also happen to be expressing the fact that they are dead also, and the timing then is later confirmed. And that is kind of the fundamental thing that separates the crisis apparition from your average ghostly encounter, if there is such a thing.
Oh, there is. Well, I've seen them, but and the data, well, the data is definitely pointing towards it for sure. Yeah, and I guess the other question I had, oh, first I should mention too, as we were talking before, and the Elvis book that's coming out, of course, I have a section of what happened after Elvis died, and he pretty much hits all the notes of your book. The day he died, he did appear to people in the flesh.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
He appeared like there was a farmer, and this farmer once was going to lose his farm, and Elvis came and bought him like a $30,000 truck or a tractor. That's what he did. He did no strings attached. And then the
Wow.
farmer was working, and Elvis appeared, and the farmer's like, Elvis, what are you doing? It was in Memphis. What are you doing here? And Elvis is like, just came to say goodbye. And then suddenly his wife comes out of the house. I heard Elvis died. And he turned around and Elvis was gone. This happened more. And of course, then there's a telekinetic thing. People saw when they'd play Elvis, their tapes would explode, electricity, moving clothes. I mean, there's so much. And of course, after Elvis died, as we're saying, after Jesus, Bigfoot, the Virgin Mary, and UFOs, Elvis is the biggest apparition in Western culture. But I saw
I did not know that.
he falls under the your rubric. And yeah, even if you go to the Graceland website now, Daniel, there's a whole web page where you can write in your Elvis apparition. So
Wow.
there's
Wow.
thousands of them going. So
I
he's
didn't know
not.
that. That's interesting.
Yeah, and I have a whole chapter, and it's incredible how many times he's appeared to people and still does. So
Well, I actually look forward to reading that, and it's interesting that you mentioned some of the, like even the experience with the farmer. One thing that struck me there is just the extent to which it's kind of very straightforward, kind of simple and unembellished.
right,
Like
yeah,
this is kind of one of the defining characteristics of the crisis apparition. It's kind of in stark contrast to our kind of cultural perceptions of maybe the literary ghost, for example, these kind of chain rattling kind of specters. It is very different. Yeah, it's
yeah,
very, very, it's incredibly, it's almost like, although the experiences are obviously inherently fascinating and kind of mysterious, and even to the experiencers at the moment. However, oftentimes they even say that this felt, although I never experienced anything like this before, it actually felt entirely natural and normal. It felt like, oh, this just happens to be the way the universe works. Oh, I realize that now. I didn't realize it up to this point, but I can kind of feel that now. And it's kind of a normal thing. You see something similar in the near-death literature also. I mean, you're talking about people who have suddenly been ostensibly expelled from their bodies and are seeing things from a perspective that they've never seen them before, and yet the reaction is often not surprise. Don't get me wrong, it can be, but very commonly it's that feeling of, oh, okay, I see, this is how the universe works, I understand now. And it's interesting. That's just something that's interesting and struck me in that Elvis account, and also comes out in the tales, the legend, the lyric, and the lore.
hmm yeah, very true. And yeah, and I have a section where people go to the afterlife and they meet Elvis in paradise. He usually kicks them out. It's like, you ain't done, honey, go back. Or or right before they die, I have examples. People, they're in the hospital, they go, Elvis, they see, and before the ghost leaves them. So
Wow, that's interesting.
yes, I know.
And I've often wondered though, if you don't, like, we know that the deathbed vision, it's often deceased relatives that will come to take you away, and they often appear days before. And in fact, like, their whatever their actual meaning, their importance has been established. Like their appearance alone is often enough to suggest to the physician that death is close.
Yeah,
But
that's true.
but I have often wondered, if you don't necessarily have deceased family members or somebody that you had these deep connections with, Maybe someone like Elvis will pop in. Who knows? That's the point. Who knows?
It'll be entertaining.
He picks up the slack, as it were.
Very true. Yes, and when you talk about how it was just normal, it's like just Elvis appeared, I think some have said that the reason is that we've been programmed in Western culture to think of the glowing guy with the chains, or of course, the ghost, the famous trope. And they say that's a Victorian era, you might say, trope, because when they started doing photography or putting it in theater or early film, they're like, we need something cool. So they started, painting the guy white or putting a sheet or using glowing effects. But yeah, in ancient times or in these apparitions, is just, what are they, mostly human, like talking to you?
They're mostly like these apparitions often do have kind of mildly unearthly characteristics, like they may glow a little, for example. Like, don't get me wrong, like some of the apparitions do have characteristics such as glowing, or maybe even being slightly transparent, for example. However, it seems the majority are visually indistinguishable from actual people, and this is something that comes out in the tales also. Like, they seem solid. It's to the extent that there have even been some researchers who have suggested that because these apparitions also often look so indistinguishable from living people, it may be the case that it's almost impossible to gauge how many apparitions somebody may have actually seen, because if they're that realistic, they could be walking down the road, you don't know. But
well, that's
certainly they do appear and often disappear. That's an important point. They often kind of disappear from existence, or kind of suddenly aren't there, for example. They're often very brief encounters, minutes at most. Usually it would be very rare to go on any longer than that. And what the experience you cited is very typical. I just came to say goodbye. It just seems like, and you spoke to these kind of cultural dynamics earlier, like it may be surprising in our kind of current cultural kind of climate that a ghost, that some sort of aspect of the individual may come to say goodbye. But there are many cases in the book where there is no surprise at these experiences. Certain cultures, such as one of the examples in the book came from the HMS Beagle, which was the ship Charles Darwin actually traveled on famously. And a guy called Jemmy Button, he had taken from Tierra del Fuego, a native of the Yamana, on the way back to Tierra del Fuego. The two of Jemmy's shipmates were kind of wondering, something seemed off with him. He seemed a little bit quiet, and he said that during the night, a dark figure, unrecognized, had come and told him and whispered in his ear at night that his father had died. And when they arrived back to Tierra del Fuego, of course, they discovered that his father had actually died during the time in which they were at sea. But what's interesting is that he didn't in any way take that as anything other than a normal thing. It didn't surprise this guy that the universe would happen to communicate in this way, that things would happen to work this way. And you can find analogs to that even in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, where many groups expected the supernatural to the extent that these types of experiences wouldn't have been necessarily surprising or out of kilter, or kind of thrown people for a loop in the way they may still today.
Yes, and we should bring, for sure, it may be controversial for some, but we had a topic on this show with researcher Robert Connor, and we have to bring in Jesus, because he said Jesus does fall into the trope of the apparition, the crisis right? He dies and suddenly he appears to Mary, and he's not some bright light or angel. He's just some guy, and he's like, hey, Mary, just don't touch me. And he appears to apostles and others in different forms. So Jesus could be a crisis apparition.
Absolutely, and a collective crisis apparition, as they're called, because more than one person had seen him. And there is a chapter in the book which deals specifically with collective accounts, and historically those have been kind of considered as especially evidential of their externality. But I deal with accounts that are not just collective in the sense that people are together when this occurs. I deal with accounts wherein the apparition may appear to separate people who are far distant from each other, but at the same time, or in and around the same time. I call these making the rounds accounts. and that's a reference to to a sentence from the Guggenheim's book, which is a classic in the field, Hello from Heaven, still one of the best, if not the best, works on after-death communications. So yeah, he would qualify in that regard. That's interesting because I do reference other examples from, for instance, the pseudepigrapha, the kind of non-canonical texts related to the Bible. And I would want to be clear, this book doesn't just deal with apparitions, it deals with other intimations of a distant death too, such as clairvoyant visions of the actual scene of the death itself. And one of the most ancient in that regard would come from the life of Adam and Eve, an uncanonical
that
text.
was one of my favorite sections, because I love that text.
It's absolutely fascinating because not only, first of all, I have never heard it referenced by psychical researchers, which surprised me. It's very basic in the sense that it follows the formula of the kind of, so in folklore, the murder made known in a dream trope. It's a classic kind of folklore. I can't remember the actual exact number, but it's like in Thompson's Index, but it's in there. And so basically, like the idea is that Eve, while sleeping, dreams that in detail that she is at the scene of her son killing her other son, Cain and Abel. The idea is she then wakes up, tells Adam the dream. Adam decides that based on the dream, we should go and see if it's true, which in and of itself is interesting because it speaks to the beliefs and expectations of those two people as to the extent to which the dream in general may be truth revealing. So they go and do discover that not only, of course, that he is dead, but the manner of the death was conveyed accurately as well, which is interesting. And of course, then the location of the body. And then I go into the book then and note that this is kind of classic behavior then that would in the later folklore also. The ghost often reveals the specific location of their body, either themselves or it is revealed in a vision. And this is something that comes out in a kind of a typical line of kind of recognizable aspects from that time to now. And that's something I think is important because very commonly we kind of hear this idea that, these kind of sociologists often come in and speak of the ghost as kind of this solely kind of sociological phenomenon. It changes with the times. We need it to be the way it is, and therefore it is that way. But it's not the case with the Christ apparition in many ways. In many ways, it's been very stable through time. And one of the reasons is because of its simplicity, because of the extent to which it's brief and unembellished. It kind of can survive through time much easier for that reason, in my opinion.
Yes, for the audience, Daniel does a great job bringing in ancient or early Christian tales, apocrypha, saints, because a lot of the audience is into that. So you'll get your cool ghosts and apparitions. And yeah, the life of Adam, I believe people have wondered why in Islam there's the idea that Iblis or Satan wouldn't bow down to humans, and that's why he was cast out. I think that's the first time that this is put out. So this is actually pre-Islamic, and Muhammad must have gotten a hold of this sort of tradition where Satan's like, I ain't bowing down to these monkeys, I'm cool, and God's like, well, then you're fired.
Absolutely,
yeah,
it is something that, just to speak to your audience specifically, that is interesting because these types of experiences I found are very commonly recorded in the lives of the saints. And that is something that it has been very sporadically referenced at times over the last 100 years by certain parapsychologists, but it's not something that has really been delved into. And I'm not entirely sure why. I found, especially, for example, that these accounts were very common in the lives of the Irish saints from my own country. And I will say that I actually found extrasensory experiences, or at least experiences entirely analogous to those we still record today, to be especially common in the Irish sources also. It's very interesting to see the extent to which the Christ apparition itself turns up there. And even in the English accounts, for example, like the Saint Cuthbert, there are certain, and I don't know if I'm saying that right because there are multiple ways to pronounce it, but we'll let it go for now. But even like these visions are even implemented such that there, in Cuthbert's life, for example, it was one of these visions which actually turned him to the monastic path in the first place, which actually set him about becoming that famous, one of the most famous saints in the history of England. So it's interesting to note that so that put simply, like, we know now today that these experiences can have impacts on individuals that may change them in fundamental ways. So that's why I find it interesting that that also comes out in these texts, and is kind of even we obviously, there is going to be an extent in the saint's life to which these actually are occurrences or implementations by the hagiographer, but there's no doubt we know they occur. So to see the after effects being similar even in these tales, I find to be kind of fascinating, and speaks to the connection between the accounts through time.
Yes, indeed. And then a sync recently, we had Jack Hart, and we had a show, but mostly on Philip K. Dick. But his book of he's a deadhead, so he talked about the Grateful Dead, and I never knew this because I was never a deadhead. But the name is after this legend where let's say Daniel Vance or I were walking down the street, we meet some guy, and he's like, "Hey, I'm dead, but I haven't had a proper burial. We don't know each other, but if you can help me, I will do something beneficial in your life, something supernatural or financial." And if this person helps get him a grave or something like that, then the dead was like, now I can rest. So
Fascinating.
have
Yeah,
you
that's
heard
like
of that? Yeah.
yeah, that's like the classic kind of Grateful Dead phenomenon in folklore. Like
Yeah.
the idea, like even when you mentioned the Elvis story, I noted that you mentioned something financial occurred in one of those tales, and that's interesting because in general, the ghost has historically and in the folklore and in the legends, they have been willing to they are known to know more than we know. In other words, they have the capacity to have knowledge of distant events and distant occurrences, and they have a kind of a broader sense of things, and that's often why they were invoked in the first place, or why, like, the necromancy and just kind of summoning spirits. But not just that, like the shaman summoning spoke often. They attributed the information they obtained regarding distant events specifically to their deceased relatives, and not to mention that many of their initial powers came in that way too. And even when the shaman in many cultures met with power animals, for example, those animals in those cultures, in those cultures, it's often known that deceased relatives can actually appear as animals. So it does often go back to the dead. And so the idea that the dead have information that we can make use of is incredibly widespread. But not only that, but it is still occurring today in numbers. Like, very commonly today, you will still hear the story that I have never had this type of I've never had any kind of apparitional experience in my life. However, there was this one time, which is the classic qualifier, where for example, my deceased husband appeared and told me where my missing key was, or my missing literally the house key. These types of stories are found. Yeah, so that's why it's interesting too, because there are these deeply kind of seemingly mundane things that these ghosts seem to be concerned with. Now, we can go deeper and go into what the hell is what's mundane, what isn't. It's not up to us to decide what somebody finds interesting. It kind of reminds me of the whole thing of, like, why would aliens want to study humans? It's what a ridiculous question. I mean, we have people who sit around looking at ant farms all day. We'll find anything fascinating if we're interested enough in it. So it's not for us to know, but certainly I would say that the takeaway from that is that the idea that the ghost knows more than we do, and the information can either be given by them or attained spontaneously, has a very real founding in experience. And and we know that just because those accounts are still occurring today.
Well said indeed, for sure. Vance, do you have a question?
Oh, only about 5 million.
I've got time for 4.9999999. Yeah.
One of the things I was interested in is there any record of apparitions where they were cremated and yet their bodies still appeared as apparitions to people?
That is a very specific and interesting question, and I don't know off the top of my head if I have read anything of that kind. However, there are certain cultures where I believe there are, off the top of my head, I apologize, I can't name them, but I believe I came across certain cultures who do dispose of the body and did nevertheless experience crisis apparitions, but I didn't note that in the
Yeah, in
book, so I do
Hinduism,
apologize for that.
You always
Mm,
burn the body. Tibetan Buddhism, you give the body to the
there
vultures.
you,
Yeah, so, yeah.
exactly, exactly. But the thing
Ah,
about the crisis apparition is that usually it will occur in and around the actual death itself, as
ah,
opposed to the cremation.
too
So it is
early.
a
Yeah.
yeah. So that would be more a question for the general after death communication in the longer period.
Definitely. And to that end, and this would not also not be from the crisis apparition. I was wondering if there's a what the maximum time shift is. In other words, um, have people seen apparitions from many years or many centuries ago? And if so, what's the largest amount of time that you've encountered in your studies, where where people have seen apparitions that were far before their own time?
Interesting. So, again, I'm not entirely sure of the specifics off the top of my head. However, I know that like I've come across many accounts in the literature wherein the individual, for example, will be staying in a house or a hotel, and they will during the night, maybe, who knows, walking up the stairs along the hall, they may see somebody and they may see what they don't necessarily. Sometimes they know it's a ghost, other times they don't, and they will then speak to maybe the owner, and the owner will kind of jokingly say, "Oh, so you saw such and such." It's kind of a known thing. But at times those will be in relation to people who had stayed in that there like decades ago, up to 50
Ah,
years ago, maybe 60, 70 years ago. So this is absolutely what you're speaking about, is more related to the hunter type apparitions, and this is absolutely a seemingly real phenomenon. And yes, it can also relate to discoveries of death too, though, as I said, because those accounts do qualify once you take away that arbitrary 12 hours before and after time period.
interesting. And I was also wondering if the apparition, we can perceive the apparitions by definition, but is there any sign that they can actually perceive us, or is it almost like a broadcast where they are
Interesting.
really? Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. In these accounts, for the most part, actually, I'll tell you something interesting, is that it's both. So it does seem that in the majority of accounts, the apparition, and I'll use these words because there are no other words at the moment, behaves and acts in a manner as if the individual, as if they are aware of the individual's presence, such that they may speak directly to them. For example, they may hold eye contact with them. For example, they may offer the information. Like I said before, like sometimes the apparition may simply emote a goodbye. Again, something fascinating because they are literally dying, so it relates to their situation. So it's contextually relevant hallucination, not just a hallucination, as it were. And again, I use that term sparingly also. But yeah, but I do want to note, however, that in a set, I'm working on. I've finished a second book at the moment called Telepathic Tales, and in that
Mhm.
book, there's a chapter which deals with what I call disinterested shades. So those are ghosts wherein, and this is something that actually speaks to, maybe, like, you could argue this speaks to a battery of evidence regarding the apparition's externality, because commonly the apparition actually completely ignores the individual. They may walk past them on the street, for example. The individual may try to get their attention, but nothing happens. In other words, it would be very challenging in that situation to ascribe the experience solely to the wish fulfillment of the individual, because clearly their wish in that moment is for the apparition to speak to them. But that's kind of a side note. The point is that in relation to your question, yes, many times there is no interaction. The apparition doesn't seem aware. But what's interesting is that they still are representing someone who has died at that moment. So it's a really strange thing, but it is something that comes out and it doesn't just come out in like modern accounts. It's something that I found, for instance, in certain Guatemalan and Mayan accounts, for example, and that's something that you will see in the second book.
Very interesting.
Ghosts that ignore you. They were probably married men, right? Take out
Yeah,
the trash, and the ghost just walks away.
absolutely. Or actually, to speak to another point earlier, was that, like, there are accounts where for instance, I'll take the role. I hear a knock at my door, and somebody tells me that somebody has come to them and told them to tell me that they're dead. Okay, in other words, there are these actual accounts in the literature wherein it seems to imply that, and this does come out clearly in the literature, that some people have a greater capacity to be tuned into these experiences or to have these experiences. And this is kind of, it speaks to the kind of classic delineation between the seer and the kind of average person, the kind of shaman and the lay person, for example, the saint and the laity. Again, it's kind of, it does speak to that, but again, that dichotomy still occurs in modern accounts, and it's something that even researchers such as the likes of Hilary Evans in his work Seeing Ghosts, an amazing underrated work I would suggest everyone read regarding the ghost experience. He makes the case that accounts like this actually make solely telepathic explanations of these experiences very challenging, and he goes into great detail on why.
Very interesting. Yeah, I'm looking at the chat, and people are offering their own experiences. So
Really? Wow.
I was thinking, Daniel, you should you should start a Substack or something, or allow people to write their own experiences, because that could be, you could catalog these experiences for,
Absolutely, I would be
future
absolutely.
work. So
Yeah, I would love
yeah,
that. If people would like to share their experiences with me, I'd be happy for them to do so through my socials.
yeah, yeah, and some of these stories are very poignant, and sometimes they're very healing too.
Mm.
The dead can talk to you, leave you one last message or omen, and of course, I've had them come in my dreams. So
That's so true, and the healing aspect. I mean, there's an account in the book, for example, just to take one example, where like the famous poet Wilfred Owen, while on a boat, his brother had died while he was on a cruise. He was unaware of this. However, his brother did appear to him at that time, and Owen actually put the curing of his depression down to that experience, which is fascinating. And you see the same with the likes of playwright David Belasco. He wrote, we can see how these experiences not only impel kind of personal transformation. Now, I don't want to overstate it and say this is vast and it's always the case, but it is the case often enough to be something worth looking at. And of course, if it happens to one person, it's worth looking at because that's their entire existence, So
yeah,
Belasco, when Belasco's mother died at a distance in Chicago, he was, I don't remember where he was staying, maybe New York at the time. However, he woke up to the form of his mother at his bedside, just stating the words "Davy, Davy, Davy." She said it 3 times, and he then discovered, of course, that she had died at that moment. And he
mhm,
said that it was his mother coming back in that moment that assured him that the dead return. They actually do return, and he even based certain aspects of his play, The Return of Peter Grimm, on the beliefs that came from that experience. So these are powerful experiences that often in a moment can reorient the individual's entire sense of their place in the cosmos. And that's why they're fundamentally fascinating and important and deserve our attention.
I agree. And then there's the category. Again, your book categorizes everything very organized. You create a system, but there's a category within the dead never leave you alone. Examples: William Blake, his brother died and was always around. I mean, William Blake could always see the spirit world. When
Mm.
Elvis, his twin brother, died at birth, was always a voice in his head. Philip K. Dick, his sister, died when he was born. So there's this where this family member just is always there. And of course, in
That
Mexican culture, South American cultures, that's more normal. That
it is.
happens a lot. Yeah.
That's so fascinating that you say that, because if you think about it, like you can imagine anecdotes like that. You can imagine experiences like that being kind of the source of certain beliefs in indigenous communities, for example. Like the idea that one has a kind of like a spirit guide or totem type, that you
Yeah.
can imagine in another time the type of experience you just mentioned, the voice always being in the individual's head, the voice of a deceased person being the source of beliefs of that kind. Now, that's not me saying that therefore ghosts aren't real by any means. I'm just making the point that that could have been the initial kind of stepping in point, which is
Right.
just an interesting side point that came to mind.
Yeah. No, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah,
Vince,
I wonder.
go ahead.
Yeah, I wonder if they've ever told us information about what life is like after life. In other words, have
Mm.
the apparition said, "Oh, it's peaceful here," or "Oh no, it's like burning hell over here? You know.
Bring a
It's
bathing
all,
suit.
it's all burning hell. It's all burning hell.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. No.
Oh, that you said it was all Benny Hill. It's like, I'm in.
But yeah, so with the crisis apparition itself, because they're so brief and because the messages are so pointed, like these are often moments where it's just clearly set up. It seems to be just clearly set up to impart the news of the death and nothing else. However, there are certain accounts. First of all, I would say for any listeners who are interested to go to like the near-death literature or the general after-death communication or deathbed vision literature to find out kind of the types of answers that have been given to the question you just asked. But regarding the crisis apparition, there are some experiences where we do have some ideas, like it's beautiful over here. You may hear that word at the you may hear that sentence at the time somebody dies and then discover they died at the time you heard that sentence. Or for example, I remember in Harry Hyatt's folklore collection, I believe from Illinois in the 40s, he had an account where somebody had looked out their window at night and seen their grandfather walking through the woods. Obviously, clearly strange in and of itself, but it was to get stranger because he was walking towards what seemed to be some sort of like, the only thing you could describe it as was like light, a kind of a tunnel or an opening of light, and was being seemingly greeted. And you'll see this in other accounts too, where the individual is being greeted by beings, maybe relatives, who knows, but they're beings. But the point that I'm making is that you could take that as an intimation as to the nature of the next world. And also, what's another very interesting point there is that, again, just to be clear, by the way, her father the grandfather was later found to have died at that exact moment, of course. But what's interesting there is that type of imagery is very common to the near-death experience. So it's interesting to see in the crisis apparition where you had no expectation of the death, and you didn't know you were looking at a dead person, as it were, and yet they're actually seeming to be undergoing certain aspects of what we know to be a near-death experience. That is a very powerful connection, in my opinion, something that I find interesting, and think that very little work has been done in that area. And it is something that I'm working on at the moment for another book, but it's something that I would love people to kind of consider.
Sure. That's fascinating.
Yeah,
It
for
really
sure.
is. It's very interesting, and it's fascinating to me that it hasn't necessarily been picked up on, because it's not just that. Like, if I may, like there are some other interesting connections between the crisis apparition and near-death experience, which speak to, in my opinion, many different avenues of inquiry. And one of those is that, in and of itself, it's been noted, a little more than sporadically noted, that during the near-death experience, the deceased relatives met with often appear younger, in their prime, maybe 30 to 40 years of age, decades often. That in and of itself has not been explored deeply enough, in my opinion. However, what's very, very fascinating is that during the crisis apparition, I have found dozens of accounts wherein the apparition also appears younger. So what's interesting there is that, again, not only is the fact that a deceased person appears younger during the near-death experience a known established fact, but we know the individual was looking at an apparition. They were looking at the form of a person they did not know were dead. So how we can ascribe such idiosyncratic and specifically known characteristics of apparitions seen of people who are known to be dead to those we don't know are dead, that's an interesting connection there, and I think speaks to something that has been a little bit overlooked.
Definitely.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And the other question I had for you, Daniel, is again, I know there's more because, for example, I started thinking of, what I've read and everything else. And I remember the poet Shelley, he started having visions of seeing himself. He would see himself and started, I think, talk to himself a few times. And then he died in the shipwreck a few days later. And then, and this, I'm tapping into the research of Anthony Peake. There's a legend in Germany of the doppelganger. Well, if you see yourself, it's an omen of your death. So what do you think of that, or anything similar in your book?
So, not in the book, however, in the second book,
Yeah,
This
that's
speaks to, yeah, this, if you'll allow me, this speaks to something
please.
very interesting because, yes, it's what's interesting about the account. Okay, so in general, like sightings of the dead or the presence of the dead often indicates death on that is actually incoming in the family. Like
Mm,
this is something that comes out powerfully in the folklore, like this sight of a dead person. So and this, to speak to your doppelganger, it's also the case with those doppelgangers. But what's interesting is that, so in the second book, I take the approach from this book, the cross-cultural and historical approach, but I apply it to a much broader range of extrasensory phenomenon. But that's with a focus on certain phenomenon that have been very underrepresented in the literature. And one of those speaks to your point, which is nearing death awareness. It's becoming aware, not vaguely of when you may die, but the specific day that you will die. And what's interesting is that this is a phenomenon that has been essentially established as a medically real phenomenon. Like we know from studies that were published, for instance, in the Lancet, that it's almost impossible for physicians today to even predict the week of the patient's death, and yet they will often predict the very day of their death commonly. And what's fascinating is that this comes out again in the sources that I've looked at. You'll find this. For instance, you may read something of this kind in the lives of a saint, and there are hundreds in the lives of saints, and think, okay, this is a kind of a way to speak to the individual sanctity. It's a nice plot device, but nothing more. However, these accounts still occur and have been recorded in detail by many researchers, such as Osis and Haraldson, Peter Fenwick, many different caregivers. The idea that somebody, so again, just to be clear, the presence of the dead indicates oncoming death, and that only spoke to your point because that can also be the case with a doppelganger.
yeah, exactly. Well, I saw a super chat, Vincent, because it kind of relates to this. And I think it's actually a really good question from Elder Zimria. And let me pull it in. I don't know if you're familiar. Oops, sorry about that. I don't know if you're familiar with the Mothman, but he writes, "This is such a great discussion. Is Mothman connected to these types of apparitions?" And yeah, it is true. I mean, Chicago had a full of Mothmen, and there's so many stories where this being appears, and then there's some great tragedy or disaster or something like that. Maybe he's a dead god. Anything you
Maybe.
want to speak to this?
Well, I will say that I don't know much about that, but what you just said, if he is connected to these kind of moments of oncoming disaster, then maybe there is a direct connection. Maybe there is a connection between this being and the realm of the dead. Who knows? We know from certain near-death experiences and other types of experiences that at times the other world can speak to us in a language that we are familiar with specifically. So, like. There are even ancient accounts wherein the individual will come across beings in the other world who specifically tell him that we're appearing this way so that you're comfortable. So whether now do I think a Mothman is going to make people comfortable? I don't know. But my point is that there could be some sort of relationship there, and for whatever reason it takes that form. I cannot speak authoritatively on it though.
No, so yeah, no, great answer. Yeah, and I'm looking at the super chat. Thanks for your support, Mad Max. And yes, Chester, good to see you. Thanks for your support. Sorry the Cowboys are not going to make the playoffs. Neither will the Bears. Yes, speaking shop. But yeah, Vince, I know you have more questions. I want to get you in.
Well, let's see. I think I'm almost. Oh yeah, there was one more that I wanted to ask. Daniel, what do you think about the effect that the biblical religions have had in suppressing people's experiences of apparitions?
Interesting. So what's interesting there is that something that I find interesting there is that, like, for instance, in the middle, in the like at the very base of like medieval visionary literature, the likes of the Pope Gregory the Great, etc. Like, what's interesting is that you do find these apparitions; they are there, although these qualifications are often specifically made in the literature that the kind of post-biblical literature that you refer to. That it's only the dead martyr. It's only to the martyr or to the saint that these dead people appear, for example. And in my opinion, like, the church in its different forms, there came the realization that these experiences, and this is still the case today, these experiences happen so commonly, they're so widespread, they're so ubiquitous, that it's essentially impossible to deny that they actually occur. So they have to be in some way taken control of. And I believe that those types of qualifications, such as they may only relate to the martyr or the saint, it would be an example of that. But nevertheless, though, these miracle collections were read widely, often by the public, and they are full of apparitions and visions, which are essentially indistinguishable from those that still occur today. So whatever efforts were made, and this is especially the case, post Reformation, the extent to which Protestantism denied like the miracle as a general concept. You can imagine centuries there where these types of experiences, if they weren't actively suppressed, they certainly were not encouraged or looked into, for example, from that side of things. However, thankfully, I have found that however sporadic or ubiquitous source depending, they have been recorded through time. They have kind of resisted these types of cultural changes and implementations, and I think that is because that speaks to the extent to which they are fundamentally real, ongoing, and natural parts of the human experience.
Yeah, and it
Yeah.
should be mentioned too that the Catholic Church is always, maybe the Greek Orthodox, has not had a problem with speaking to the dead, prayers
Exactly.
for the intercession of the dead. And even, I don't know about Ireland, Daniel, but the magic realism was never a problem when I grew up in Portugal and Mexico. For example, when somebody would pass away, the next day, if you talked about this person, my mom, and they would whisper, "Did you know that they did this?" And I'd be like, as a kid, why are they whispering? Of course, they didn't want the dead to come, you know what I mean, to show
Yeah.
up in their conversation. So it was part of the culture that, the dead have to, there's a reverence, but also don't invite them in because you might run into them while you take a walk with the dog that night. So,
Yeah, there is that kind of dichotomous, if that's a word, relationship, because they're often, as we spoke to earlier, like the dead are often, although they often seem to offer help and kind of offer information. They are also heralds of death and quote unquote bad things. Of course, we can debate whether or not death is actually a bad thing. That's a different conversation. But yeah, that is certainly a fascinating point.
yeah. Were you going to say something, Vince?
Yeah.
Sorry about
I
that
was.
camera here. It's kind of blurring.
Yeah, you're about. Yeah,
He's an apparition the whole time. I knew it.
Yeah, the background blur. The back of your background blur thinks that you're blurring.
Wow.
Yeah. Perfect. I was going to tell you about, and this is amazing. I've had 3 visitation dreams, which I've called, which are different in my lifetime, over a whole lifetime of dreams. And so they distinguish themselves by the feeling and the realism. 2 of them were, my uncle and my grandfather, who had already passed. And the third one was about somebody who had already passed, but it was John Lennon. And
wow.
As a kid, I liked the Beatles, and I played guitar as a kid, and I used to play Beatles songs and so forth. But over the years, I grew sour on John because, I figure, oh, he's just a hippie and he's against my country and this and that, but the night that I had that dream, I had a dream I was playing my guitar in a band, and John Lennon came up, and he said, and he played music with us for a while. And I said, wow, this is really cool. And then after that, we stopped playing, and he sat me down and he talked to me about, well, this is the way I really feel about things. And I got the distinct impression of what he really felt, what he was really about, as opposed to what I had imagined he was about.
Fascinating.
And from that point on, it really affected the way I think about John Lennon. Like, instantly the next morning.
Wow.
And from that point on in my life. So
that's
you got to ascribe some reality to something that can change your mind, beyond your conscious self.
That's the kind of the sticking point here. That's where it becomes an issue when people kind of dismiss these types of accounts offhand. They're not taking into account the extent to which they're changing the entire kind of orientation of the individual, their philosophical ideas in within a moment. Often it's very interesting, and your point is interesting too, because something that comes out in the near-death literature also is that over there communication is not the same way it is here. There's a non-verbal kind of communication. Concepts are kind of transmitted instantaneously that we'd have to fumble around with for hours just to get out over here, for example. But so you kind of spoke to that, I think, a little bit with that experience with John Lennon,
Oh
because
yeah.
it felt to me like you had this sense, this deep, real feeling of his truth, like the truth of who he was, what he thought, etc. And
Yes.
that is actually something that is observed of the ghost, of the apparition, of the deceased during these other world journeys, which is an interesting kind of correlation there.
Yeah, get to know them.
Who is the real John Lennon then?
Who's the real John
Elvis.
Lennon?
Okay.
Well, he was deeply philosophical thinker, and he thought for himself. He was not a conformist. Um, he was a seeker. He wanted to seek truth and knowledge and so forth, and he was not against. He wasn't a subversive. Trying to undermine. The way I had thought. That's basically the gist I got from it, and I saw things afterwards about John that corroborated that.
Interesting. So you had some. Sorry, go ahead, Miguel. I think you were about to say something there.
No, I was listening.
Oh, my apologies. Sorry, I sound like the host there. I didn't mean to.
Oh, that's okay. I don't.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
we're
didn't-
all having a conversation. Nobody.
Yeah.
sorry. But I think Vance, you mentioned 2 out of what you said were 3 experiences. Was there another, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, well, my grandfather and my uncle came to me in a dream, and they were not much more than, number one, of different than other dreams. That they were present and with me, and it was a kind of a loving kind of thing, and that's very rare, in my experience. In fact, well, there's only 3 dreams like that. My uncle was the one that he had deathbed experiences of the other world come to him. He saw his mother and so forth, but he was a skeptic throughout his life.
Mm-hmm.
So, but he came to me in the dream, and again, it was more like an emotional support, a loving presence. They were with me. It was a presence dream. They were there, and it was real. And
Wow.
when I woke up, that's. I wish I could tell you that they had more information or anything, but it was more like a being with, as opposed to the John Lennon, which was actually there was interaction there, and ideas, were given to me.
And you took this as a kind of a real, kind of ontologically real thing, a feeling that this
Yes.
actually occurred, and there was an element where they had an agenda in relation to you, maybe.
Yeah. It was a
Interesting.
connection to me, and and I loved my grandfather, and I loved my uncle. My uncle was special to me, and so maybe that's why I was graced with the visitations. But
Well, yeah, like so in kind of one of the kind of main discoveries of parapsychology has been that the stronger the bond between individuals kind of speaks to the likelihood of these types of things occurring. It's not a necessity, and those accounts in which it isn't there are especially fascinating. But for the most part, yes, those bonds do seem to be important with these types of kind of communication.
yeah, thanks.
Those are incredible experiences. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah,
You
and
bet.
sometimes you don't know what the full person is. Speaking of John Lennon, thinking I'm bringing Elvis, during the early 70s, Elvis was complaining, yes, about the Beatles, or a bunch of communists. And he went to Nixon. Elvis got on a plane and helped himself into the White House because he could,
Yes.
and was bitch, goddamn communists and all that. But then, guess who called Elvis? John Lennon, because he knew he was in trouble with the government and he didn't want to get offed or something. And Elvis is
Wow.
like, all right, let me tell you what, Elvis said. After all that, Elvis helped him. He said, this is what you need to do, PR, to fix your image. And of course, Elvis, being, the consummate hypocrite, told him, you need to deny you do drugs, of all people. But he told Lennon, just come across as squeaky clean. And he helped them. It helped save, Lennon was fine in New York. Well, till 1980, but he was fine in New York and his image was clean. So
Yeah, they loved Elvis. The Beatles loved Elvis.
They met him. Yeah, they met him in the 60s. Yeah, I mean, John Lennon always said before Elvis, there was nothing. When he heard Heartbreak Hotel, he said he woke up from a bad dream. So
Wow.
but that's neither here nor there. Do you have a little bit longer for some more questions?
Sure,
Or how
yeah,
do
I'm
you
happy
think we're
to.
doing? Great,
I'm
great.
happy
Yeah,
to.
because I think there are a couple of things to cover your book that are important, and that's the idea of tokens. And of course, there's that section where you have that. Of course, I get excited. Portuguese legend about the father and children. They go into forests and they
Mm.
approach the base of the tree. The father says, "My children remain here, and here I leave this gourd. While it continues to sound, it is a sign that I am in the woods. When it stops, it is a sign that I am no longer in the wood, and I am coming for you." So I love these. Of course, I'm one of my projects is to do like Portuguese legends because there's so many. I'm sure like Ireland, you could write
Oh,
like volumes.
yes.
But tell the audience a little bit about tokens and why they're important with your book.
Yeah, so that's something that I found personally, although I have often considered the tokens chapter to maybe be the most boring. For
That
me,
was the one I liked the most, I think, because
that's
of
so
all the
interesting.
symbolism and everything else. Yeah.
Oh, don't get me wrong. I don't find it boring, but I just had this impression that would be one
Right.
other people would, but maybe I'm wrong, but I appreciate that. So I found it really interesting because what you just said, okay, so eh, worldwide, like in Aboriginal Australia, you may find a tale where the individual puts a stick in the ground and says, "When this stick falls, you will know that I'm dead." Or
Mm.
you may find among like certain tribes in Nunavut, for example, who put specialized types of shoes on the mantle and say, "When these fall from the mantle, you will know I'm dead." You find the same in like really obscure like Indian legends. I don't mean Native American here. I mean actual Indian legends, for example. You find the same thing in really small tribes. Like a guy called Verrier Elwin recorded many legends among very small tribes there. Um, and you will even find the same stick stories in Africa, for example. The point being that there seems to be a widespread belief that certain items are imbued with the capacity to they are related to the individual such that they will be impacted when the individual dies. Now, again, that is something that, first of all, it hasn't really been greatly explored as to why those experiences are so similar across unconnected
Right.
cultures. That's an interesting question in and of itself.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is that we essentially experience the same things today. Like, I consider these tales, these life token tales, to be the ancient equivalent of the modern accounts, which you find so commonly in folklore, where the picture frame dies when sorry, excuse me, the picture
Yeah.
frame falls. It certainly doesn't die.
Yeah.
Maybe it was alive, I don't know. But it it falls when somebody at a distance dies, and often the individual in that picture frame. Or, for example, a watch. This is a very common story. And you mentioned electronics going, this is something that stuck earlier as well. You mentioned the electronics in relation to Elvis. This is also something that comes out in these tales. The individual's watch may stop at the time that they had died. It was only discovered later, of course, that the watch stopped. This is very common. There are even, uh, you may recognize it. Who is it? Johnny Cash actually wrote A Grandfather Clock, which is a song
Mm.
which came from a story that he heard, I think that came originally from the 19th century. But the point is that old this song speaks directly to those experiences in which the clock stops at the very moment of somebody's death. The ultimate point here is that in the ancient tales and today, very specific items, often related or owned by that specific person, seem to be able to indicate the distant death. This comes out in the Middle Ages too. You have so many stories where the prince will say to the princess, he offers her a ring and will say, for example, "When this ring turns from blue to red, you will know that I'm dead."
Mm.
This sense that there is a connection between the two parties, mediated by this specific special item, it's incredibly widespread. It hasn't been greatly explored, and I think that it's tied into these types of modern accounts.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. And also the idea of the ocean, seafarers dying and coming out and coming. I think there's so many examples, but you talk about what the gongers, the ghosts of drowned seafarers who visit distant relatives to announce their death. So the
Mm,
ocean is also a very powerful conduit, or the manner of dying in the ocean, right?
absolutely, and like this is something you find, for instance, a lot in the Icelandic sagas, for
Mm.
example, or like the Norse tales, etc. Because in those tales you will find so much seafaring, and you will find so many deaths at sea, and so you will find many crisis apparitions related to the death at sea. And what's interesting here is that I go into this in chapter 9, which deals with the fact that it's not, I say, it's not just that the apparition appears coincident with the distant death. They often appear in specifically in a manner that is related to their death. Like, for instance, in the accounts you just referenced, the accounts of the seafarers, you will often find that the apparition is dripping, for example, or maybe there are even some Polynesian accounts where there's seaweed on the individual after they had died at sea. And like, there are many places such as Goodna Island, for example, in Polynesia. Like, there are many tribes in Polynesia who state that it's just a kind of a casually believed thing that people who die at sea or die while at war will come back to announce their death as a ghost, not just as a ghost, but specifically to announce their death. And these have been recorded widely in Polynesia, but also again, essentially everywhere that the ethnologist, the explorer, and the kind of anthropologist have gone. And of course, the main credit goes to the native tales themselves.
Yeah, they're definitely very rich. And what would you say for the audience are some of the more ancient examples of crisis apparitions? I mean, again, this goes back way, way back.
It really does. And like, even where either the sources could be looked at further, or they aren't that forthcoming with crisis apparitions, such as the Sumerian tablets, for example, you can very easily extrapolate the extent to which these types of experiences would have been known to occur, because there are many stelae, for example, which speak directly to the notion of, if you encounter a ghost, like instructions as relating to what you should do if you encounter the ghost of a stranger, for example. Now, fundamentally, encountering the ghost of a stranger can speak to the discovery of a death that you didn't know about before.
No.
So in that regard, and that again also speaks to the fact that it seems that in many cultures there aren't actually specific names for the crisis apparition. And that seems to be related to the extent to which these things were necessarily, the need didn't seem to be there to kind of distinguish them from ordinary life as much as we have today. That's something I find interesting. Now, again, though, we did mention also the account of Pharaoh Senusserwit, a poem which is written in relation to his death. And you mentioned Hamlet earlier. It's very similar. Yet this is from the Middle Kingdom of ancient Egypt, something which, again, I'm also surprised hasn't come out in the psychical research to this point. But there it is. Although kind of historians and sociologists come at it from their own perspectives, when you read this account, it is a nail-on crisis apparition. The king is killed in a raid on his castle, and he comes to his son at the same time as his death, not just to announce that he had died, but to give certain details regarding the nature of his death, in the same way that the ghost still does. You find this in the Greek romances and tragedies, etc. You find it when Polydorus, one of the most kind of famous shades of the classical world, comes and tells his mother that he had died. He doesn't just reveal that he has died, which again is later confirmed. He reveals the location of his body. And that again is something that still occurs. You will find this in obscure Welsh newspapers, for example, such as the Blackwoods magazine. You'll find examples of just your average Joe reporting dreams in which the location of bodies are found. And again, and we can speak to the Adam and Eve account again, where the location of the body, and that again is something that really ties these accounts together, because it's not just the fundamental coincidence that travels through time. It's the kind of ancillary details as well. And that is a fascinating thing. And even, honestly, just recently I saw a video. Do you know the work of David Paulides?
No.
He does work on missing people, and I think he does especially kind of mysterious cases, which are kind of seemingly hard to ascribe to like ordinary reasonings, for example. But even he just recently uploaded a video in which he cited 19 recent cases in which a dream was said to reveal the location of a body. Wow. So speaking to your point, there are so many ancient accounts. You'll find many in the book, but there are many that are not in the book because I simply couldn't fit them. But my point is that they are very very much connected to the modern accounts. And again, we would expect that if this is a real phenomenon.
Yes, and of course, one of the most famous ancient ones, and this one is in your book, is Saul and Samuel. Samuel, when King Saul goes to the witch of Endor, and Samuel comes out, "You're gonna die. You're gonna get your ass kicked in the battle," and all that. So
Yeah, it's just, and that's basically the whole account. But it's rarely cited as a discovery of a death in that way, which is kind of interesting to me. So, like again, I'm interested in intimations of a distant death in general.
right,
It just so happens that the apparition is the most kind of prominent form of these intimations. There are also auditory examples. I go into that in a chapter in the book
right.
also. There are also psychical researchers have found many examples in which kind of intuition, just these feelings that something has gone wrong around the time of the death, the two events later being linked. And what I found interesting is that I found references to that in many different cultures. I found it in Hawaii, for example, and I found it in the lives of some early modern saints, for example. And you'll see these examples in the book. So again, you will see even like great historians such as the Venerable Bede recording examples of this kind. Like the Venerable Bede, if you could barely get that one out, he records deathbed visions, for example, which are entirely indistinguishable from those that still occur today. He records visions in which somebody is dying on the bed and calls the name of somebody 3 times. The name of the person he called was found later to have died at that time. And
Wow.
those are entirely indistinguishable from those types of Pekindarian experiences that I mentioned earlier in the interview, that were recorded for the likes of Bruce Grayson, but also the likes of Frances Power Cobbs in the 19th century in an octave of essays, and that's where the word Pekindarian came from in the first place. So again, these connections are there, and the idea that okay, we can say that certain of these legends and tales are simply legends and tales. They are influenced by the need to have a plot device, a literary device, etc., etc. But the extent to which we know these are real occurrences means that it would be intellectually dishonest of us to ascribe every single one of those as having that source.
Well said indeed, and I would certainly agree. Well, as we get towards the end, Vance, any last super chats or questions from yourself?
Yeah, we do. And Mike Frank wanted to know, what about the Banshee?
Interesting, yeah. I do actually make a couple of references to the Banshee there. Like, yeah, so in Ireland, the Banshee is often said to be heard at the time of a distant death. And there are, like, some serious folklorists have recorded these types of accounts in Ireland in the last 50, 60 years. And there is actually a book, Patricia Lysad actually wrote a book called Banshee, which goes very deeply into the lore of the Banshee and in Ireland, and kind of it relates it even to some other phenomena around the world. But as the Banshee relates to this book, I will say that there are a couple of accounts in there, but they fit more broadly into the general idea that sound, auditory experiences can also seemingly give accurate information of a distant death. It may take many forms. In the lives of the saints, a bell at a distance may be heard, a beautiful song may be heard. The name, it's interesting, we mentioned the David Belasco account earlier.
Mhm.
He heard his name called 3 times by his mother. In the folklore, the name is often called 3 times. That's something interesting for whatever reason. But that is something that still actually occurs again today. I don't know if there's anything to that, but it is just an interesting side note. So yeah, thanks for the question.
Candyman.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say it. Beetlejuice. Yeah, it's obviously they're tapping
Don't
into
do
it.
it.
And
Don't do it.
I'm
It's
not.
not worth it. It's not worth it.
And I was
I
also
had one.
thinking of King. You were talking about Hamlet. Of course, I'm thinking of the Lion King. That's another one. Dies, and then James Earl Jones appears in the sky. Simba. So tapping into that.
Oh
So
yeah.
yeah.
I just saw that movie recently for the first time in actually decades. So it's funny you mention it. It's a classic.
Yeah.
Here, I had one, which is, were there any crisis apparitions after the Titanic sinking?
In this book, no. That is a very interesting question, though. I have not looked into that, but I would have to imagine there were, because although it has often been kind of overstated, like you mentioned earlier with the Mothman, a lot of these types of experiences do kind of come around disasters.
Right.
Now, because that's the case, they are extra memorable, maybe. And I would say that the extent to which this occurs may be overstated, but there is a lot, and it is very important. And I would say that I can't speak to that, but I would imagine that there are some, and I may actually have to have a little look into that now. So thank you.
Yeah. Also, World Trade Center. Any apparitions associated with the World Trade Center towers disaster?
Now there is a book, I believe, called, if I could remember the title, Messages, I think it's called. It was. I will get it to you. There is a book written by an author, Bonnie something. Again, my apologies, I don't remember, but it's Messages 9/11, and you will find experiences of that kind in there. I haven't recorded any in this book, but you absolutely will find some of those experiences in that book. Apologies for not being more specific.
Or you can check out Eric Wargo's book on predestination. He doesn't talk about it, but he talks about the precognition, how thousands of people during 9/11 and the Titanic had dreams before, and they told their friends. You know what I mean? There was something.
Yeah, I've spoken
reality
to
was being shifted. Yeah, so
yeah, it's very interesting, and I am working on some things leaning in that direction for a third book that I've just submitted to the publisher, actually.
Cool.
And it deals with experiences more related to dreams and visions related to the future.
Look forward to that one too. Awesome. Yeah, great comments. People sharing again their stories in the chat, very poignant, emotional.
Wow.
Glad they're sharing, and yeah, I really appreciate the support from people.
Thanks a lot,
And
guys.
yeah, so as we get to the end, Daniel, where do you want to send people to? I have it on the show notes, but for those on listening in our apparitions in audio form, where do you want to send people?
Absolutely. So you can find me on Twitter. Sorry, X. I always do that. I'm sure.
I still call it Twitter.
Yeah, me too. You'll find me at near_death_fe. And if you would like to get a copy of the book, you can find it on Amazon.com. It's available in Amazon.uk, Kindle only until January 16th, but it's available in bookstores nationwide as well, US and Canada. And of course, on my publisher's website, Inner Traditions.
Yes, of course.
Got to give a shout out.
Yes, great company. Yeah. Are you going to do an audiobook?
The possibility was in the contract, but nothing has been brought to me. So I don't know. I actually don't know. I haven't had any conversations about that. But that would be cool. That would be cool.
Yeah, definitely should. It's a popular medium today. I like audiobooks, and but I also like to read too. It depends how busy I am.
Is your Elvis book going to be audiobook?
Yes, I'm going to do it myself. Yeah.
How did that come about? How did that come about? Did you ask that, or was it offered? If you don't mind me asking, my apology. You don't need to answer that.
Yeah. It's I don't know. It's in the contract, and I'm like, I'll do it, and they're like, okay,
fair enough.
It's very
not to go too deep there. Apologies.
Yeah. Just reach out to them. I mean,
yeah.
They're great people. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, we are at the end. Yeah, definitely get the book. An excellent read. You'll read it many times, and it will be part of your encyclopedia and understanding, again, mysticism in general, ghosts, spirits, ancient traditions, folklore, mythology, and all that. And of course, please support Bite. I really appreciate those who support. Remind you that the virtual Alexandria Academy is 30% off with the code solstice until the end of the month. You get all 3 Astronosis events for free, or you can get all 3 Astronosis events replays for the price of 1. But support us independent authors and small writers who are trying to fill those niches and for a better, more awake world. But either way, I am very happy you are here, and I hope we have served you. So I will first say, Vance, thanks for keeping us company.
Oh, I love this subject. So it's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much, Vance.
Yes, and Daniel, thank you very much. Yeah, for the hard work and for your book. And we certainly look forward that you come and haunt us when your second and third book come on.
Hopefully not from beyond the grave.
No. Well, even then, that's no excuse. Sorry, you agreed.
I have no out there because my book proved that there's no excuse. So yeah, okay.
Of all people. So
yeah, thank you a lot for the invite, though. I appreciate it.
We really enjoyed it. And yeah, good luck with everything you do. And for the audience, I hope you have a good rest of your Saturn. I hope that you are visited by your relatives with good messages. The dead have so much to tell us, our ancestors. And yes, the world of the living and the dead is just an illusion. The ancient Egyptians and all those cats knew this. And that's why they had more wholeness and more contact with infinity. Let's get back to that, and it will help us know who we are, and we'll find more individuation and a richer life and experience. So with that, I am off my soapbox. And yes, next week we've got a couple of OGs, really pioneers in a new age and the esoterica, Gary Sukoff and Dr. Rick Strausman. And then we will have some end of the year shows, some critiques, some summaries, and it will be some good shows with Gordon White, Chris Knowles, Saul Luckman, and other guests. A solstice special. So lots going on, and I really appreciate you coming here. And that's it. Take care, everybody, and thank you.